At 0424 hours, local time, right near the frontline border between Russia and Ukraine in the Donetsk region, drone operators from the 14th Regiment of the USF were preparing for an attack on Donetsk Airport, located 45 miles to the north in Russian-controlled territory. This was where Russia had positioned transport vehicles, storage depots, and Shahed UAV launch platforms to apply pressure and launch large-scale attacks against Ukraine in an attempt to control the entire Donetsk region. But in just 34 minutes, they would lose this area to Ukraine. By 0426 hours local time, the Ukrainian drone control crew activated the launch sequence from a secret launch site. The first FP-2 accelerated along the rail. Its wings bent under the weight, then the UAV took off and accelerated to 100 miles per hour. Every 15 seconds, another drone followed off the launcher, banking northeast and heading straight toward Donetsk Airport. By 0427 hours local time, the commander of the S-300 battery suddenly noticed something unusual on the radar screen. It was not a clear attack formation, nor was it a group of large targets solid enough to lock onto immediately. Just a few strange signal streaks, faint and broken, appearing and disappearing inside the thick layer of ground clutter. But for someone who had sat in front of radar long enough, this was not a system error. Something was quietly crawling into the dead zone of Russian air defense, where radar struggled to see clearly and missiles struggled to react in time. And only a few seconds later, those faint signals began turning into a real attack. The S-300 radar was one of the key early warning layers in Russia's air defense network around Donetsk Airport. The 64 N6E Big Bird radar could scan a wide area of sky within a radius of 150 miles, while the 30 N6E flap-lid fire control radar was responsible for locking targets and guiding missiles. But what was appearing now looked nothing like what the combat crew wanted to see. These were not fighter jets, not large missiles, they were low-flying FP-2s, leaving radar signatures 50 times smaller than a missile's faint, broken, and flickering inside ground clutter. On the flap-lid screen, 26 signal streaks appeared and disappeared. They were not clear enough to lock immediately, but they did not vanish completely either. The commander leaned closer to the screen. Those light streaks did not move like birds, and they did not look like weather noise. They advanced steadily, low, slow, and with a strange rhythm in the return signal like the trace of piston engines and propellers cutting through the air. That was the moment he understood. This was not a system error. This was a swarm of UAVs crawling into the dead zone of the S-300. The distance was only 11 miles, a perfect firing range. A 5V-55R missile left its launch tube, raising a white column of fire, accelerating to Mach 4, then racing toward the faint signals, crawling close to the ground. But at an altitude of 180 feet, physics began working against the S-300. Radar waves did not only touch the UAVs, they also bounced off metal roofs, vehicles, power lines, and the terrain below, causing the real target and its reflected ghost to overlap like images in a cracked mirror. The missile saw multiple traces at once. One real streak, one false streak, one weak signal but in the right direction, one stronger signal but amplified by ground reflection. The guidance computer had only 0.3 seconds to choose. And in that moment, the system chose wrong. The first missile plunged into an empty patch of ground ahead of the UAV formation, exploding and tearing a large crater into the earth. The shockwave swept across the area, but the FP-2s had already cut their engines for 4 seconds, dropped lower, and slipped through the clutter like black shadows disappearing from radar sight. Inside the control room, the S-300 commander stared in silence as the interception point turned into a meaningless ring of light. Then an unexpected signal flared up. The second UAV suddenly climbed to 1,000 feet, pushed its engine to full power, and exposed its body and wings clearly to the flap-lid radar. It turned itself into the easiest target to see in the low sky. The S-300 crew immediately shifted lock. A second 5V-55R was launched. A fireball opened in midair. The third UAV disappeared from the screen, a perfect interception. But the Russians did not know that this was exactly what Ukraine wanted. While the S-300 focused on the target that had just climbed, the remaining drones restarted their engines. The small roar of piston engines returned as 25 black shadows dispersed at an altitude of 160 feet continuing to spread the formation wider. They were no longer flying in a line. They spread across a 3-mile front, splitting their signals and stretching the radar's viewing angle. The distance was now only 9 miles. The commander clenched his jaw as the signal streaks began dissolving into ground clutter. The system was still trying to rebuild the battlefield picture, but the UAV swarm had already passed through the first interception layer. They had traded one UAV, one risky climb to 1,000 feet, and 3 seconds of exposure to radar to pull S-300 fire away from the main formation. But only 4 minutes later, the 25 remaining FP-2s would meet an invisible wall they did not yet know was waiting ahead. At 04:31 hours, local time, the surviving formation entered the border area between Luhansk and northern Donetsk. They flew about 600 yards apart, held an altitude of 160 feet, and maintained a speed of 120 miles per hour. Beneath them were industrial hillsides, old mining pits, abandoned warehouses, and scattered residential strips across the Donetsk Highlands. The terrain here did not only make radar detection difficult, it was also an ideal place for Russia to deploy a deeper layer of electronic warfare. That layer was Krasuka 4. The first sign was very small. The navigation receiver of the lead UAV still showed a stable flight path, the data link remained silent, the inertial system still held the correct heading. Then the reference signals began to drift. Coordinates wavered slightly. The map inside the processor no longer fully matched the real trajectory. Only a few seconds later, the lead drone's flight path began drifting away from the program corridor. It was not a mechanical failure, not a crosswind, it was an electronic chokehold. Krasuka 4 was designed to attack the most invisible part of the battlefield. Radio signals, radar, control links, and the electronic channels that unmanned aircraft use to navigate and keep their mission stable. From hidden positions on high ground, it spread a wide layer of interference over the flight corridor, causing weak signals from satellites, sensors, and data links to mix inside an electronic storm. For a small FP-2, that was dangerous enough. The receiver on the UAV did not have the power of a large military system. When interference from the ground became stronger than the real reference signal, the computer could no longer tell which direction was correct, which was error, and which was false data. From that moment, the FP-2s could rely only on their internal inertial system, gyroscopes, accelerometers, and the preloaded flight route. But inertial navigation was not perfect. At 120 miles per hour, the formation covered nearly 2 miles every minute. With only a very small angular error, after a few dozen miles, a UAV could slide out of the approach corridor, fly into an air defense fire zone, or completely miss the route leading into Donetsk Airport. The 25 UAVs still maintained absolute silence. No signal transmission, no active sensors, no attempt to communicate. They flew like silent black shadows through a corridor that Krasuka 4 was distorting second by second. The processor of the lead drone began recalculating. If the entire formation continued holding the old heading, the error would grow minute by minute. If a few drones broke formation, climbed higher, and widened their flight paths, they could force the Russian system to expose gaps in the jamming zone. The remaining drones would have a chance to continue the mission. And then the 4 leading drones made their choice. They did not try to save themselves. They began drifting away from the formation, gently increasing altitude and widening their trajectories, turning themselves into test decoys for the electronic wall of Krasuka 4. It was a cold decision, calculated by algorithm, but its meaning was very simple. 4 drones had to pay the price so that 21 others could continue rushing toward Donetsk Airport. At 04:34 hours, local time, the 4 leading FP-2s broke radio silence. The signal lasted exactly 2 seconds. A coordinate correction request, a formation synchronization packet, a split-second burst of data inside airspace already being distorted by Krasuka 4. But that was enough. Russian electronic warfare stations around the Donetsk perimeter immediately registered the abnormal emission source. In that brief moment, the 4 leading UAVs turned themselves into the only bright points inside an almost completely silent airspace. Warning data was pushed back to the rear air defense line. The S-300 batteries immediately received the approach direction and the suspected target area. The combat crews did not need much more time. they had the firing zone, they had the movement direction, and they had the order to fire. Only 7 seconds later, 5 V-55R missiles left their launch tubes, raising white columns of fire in the darkness, accelerating to more than Mach 3, then turning toward the signals that had just appeared. At a distance of only 9 miles, the S-300 was no longer firing at a clear formation, but at an area of sky where real and false signals were overlapping. But the 4 leading FP-2s had already completed their role. Immediately after transmitting, 2 banked hard 45 degrees to the left, while the other 2 split to the right, climbed to 800 feet, and continued pulsing intermittently like lighthouses, deliberately exposing themselves. On Russian radar screens and electronic reconnaissance systems, they became the clearest targets in the area. 4 bright signals separated from the main formation, pulling every eye toward the southwest. It was an electronic sacrifice. The 5 V-55R missiles rushed toward the interception zone, but the real formation was no longer there. Most of the remaining FP-2s had dropped lower, shut down all unnecessary emissions, and slipped along the edge of Krasika 4's interference field. The proximity fuses found only reflected ghosts, false signals, and empty space. A series of explosions tore through the low sky, scattering fragments over the hillsides, mining waste fields, and dark strips of steppe below. Meanwhile, the remaining 21 FP-2s had received exactly what they needed. Coordinates had been corrected, inertial drift had been pulled back to an acceptable level, the formation had been synchronized again, and from that moment on, they transmitted nothing else. Behind them, the 4 leading UAVs continued drawing attention toward the northwest until the final missiles caught them. Flashes of fire burst one after another in the low sky. 4 FP-2s were torn from the formation, but that price had been calculated in advance. Krasika 4 had disoriented the UAV swarm for several minutes. The S-300 had shot down 4 targets, but in 2 seconds of sacrifice, the 4 leaders gave the remaining 21 their eyes back, and now they continued rushing toward Donetsk Airport, lower than radar, quieter than before, and more accurate than the Russians had hoped. They thought they had disappeared. After passing through the Krasika 4 jamming zone, the remaining 21 FP-2s believed they could glide through the electronic darkness lower than radar, quieter than before, and leaving behind too little signal to be locked. But what they did not know was that 8 miles away, another system had already been tracking their unusual movement traces for several minutes. It was not a long-range air defense radar. It was the one L-260 Zoopark 1M, a counter-battery reconnaissance radar originally designed to detect artillery shells, rockets, and missiles as they passed through the air. But in the low airspace around Donetsk Airport, Zoopark was being used for a different mission, finding small, low targets that appeared too briefly for conventional air defense radar to lock onto with confidence. At 0438 hours, local time, the FP-2s entered the airport area like ghosts. They dropped to only about 95 feet, reduced engine throttle to save fuel, and held a steady speed of 120 miles per hour. They had passed the S-300, they had survived the Krasika 4 jamming zone, they had let 4 decoys pull fire in another direction, and now they believed they were flying beneath the main vision layer of Russian air defense. That was why the first launch was so shocking. From the main runway area of Donetsk Airport, a Pantsir S-1 system suddenly opened fire. There was no long warning, no clearly extended lock-on process in the sky, only a white streak of fire rising from the launcher, then a 57 E-6 missile racing straight toward a pre-computed interception point. Within seconds, the UAVs understood the most frightening thing. Somehow, the Russians still knew where they were. Zoopark had seen them earlier. The one L-260 radar worked in a different way. It did not need to build a complete picture of the sky like a long-range air defense radar. It scanned narrow sectors looking for small objects moving across complex terrain. With artillery shells, it needed only a few points on the trajectory to calculate backward to the firing position. With low-flying UAVs, the dangerous principle was similar. If it captured enough movement traces over several consecutive sweeps, the computer could reconstruct the flight direction, speed, and the next point where the target would appear. The 21 FP-2s were flying through the Horlivka industrial zone between mining waste fields, workshops, power lines, and gray slopes of earth. Each one left only a very small return, but their formation had a pattern. Same speed, same approach direction, same unusually low altitude. To a normal radar, that might have looked like clutter, but to Zoopark, it was a movement path that could be calculated. After several minutes of tracking, the system had enough data. Speed, about 60 meters per second. Altitude, below 100 feet. Direction of movement, stable. The predicted intersection point was calculated and passed to the Panzer S-1 system waiting near the main runway. The Panzer crew did not need to keep its radar on for long. They only needed a short window to confirm the target zone, rotate the combat turret, and launch a missile. In that moment, Panzer's fire control radar caught the signal streaks crawling low ahead. The launch order was given. The 57 E-6 accelerated through the low air layer, racing toward the interception point. The FP-2s were still flying in silence, but this time silence no longer protected them completely. They had passed the systems that could see the farthest. But at the main runway of Donetsk Airport, the thing hunting them did not need to see far. It only needed to look in the right place at the right time. 1 minute later, 4 more missiles left the Panzer S-1 launcher near the main runway area. They accelerated to Mach 3.8 through the low air layer, racing toward the interception points Zoopark had calculated in advance. During the first seconds, the FP-2 formation received almost no clear warning, no radio signal from the UAVs, no extended lock-on process. Only a streak of fire rapidly closing the distance at terrifying speed. For those 10 seconds, the 21 UAVs continued flying in electronic silence. Their warning receivers showed nothing clear enough to react to. The first warning did not come from the screen, but from sound, the growing roar of the missile behind them. Then, when it was less than 1 mile from the predicted interception point, the missile began completing its final phase. They had only 3 seconds. At nearly 120 miles per hour, a few seconds meant more than 120 yards. The operator of the lead UAV immediately pulled the aircraft into a sharp turn. The engine surged with power. The composite frame shook under the overload. The wings bent, and the fuselage screamed through the low air. Push only a little harder, and it could snap like a dry branch. The proximity fuse activated at a distance of 50 feet. The 57 E-6 missile's warhead was designed to tear apart flying targets far larger than an FP-2. A cloud of fragments opened like a steel net in the air. 4 leading UAVs were ripped out of the formation in a brief flash, but their sacrifice warned the others. 4 more missiles were launched only 6 seconds later. Yet by then, the FP-2 formation was no longer flying in a steady rhythm. They spread out, constantly changing altitude, dropping close to 75 feet, rising above 140 feet, cutting throttle to 50% to break their pattern, then suddenly surging back to 150%. For Zoopark, the once stable movement path began to shatter. Clear, calculated traces turned into scattered points that were far harder to predict. Panzer S-1 continued firing. 1 missile entered its final phase too early, while the formation still had enough time to react. Just a few extra seconds of warning were enough to change the result. 1 FP-2 group immediately dropped close to the ground, only a few dozen feet above tree crowns, earth slopes, and low structures. At that altitude, the ground became a giant wall of clutter. Real targets, reflected ghosts, and terrain background merged together. The missile could no longer hold a clean solution. It exploded above the formation, scattering fragments into empty space instead of tearing into the UAV bodies. But not every drone was lucky. 1 FP-2 fell behind after the chaotic throttle changes. It needed a few seconds to regain speed, and those few seconds were too many. A 57 E-6 caught up from behind. The explosion flashed low against the Donetsk sky, and another FP-2 vanished from the formation. Now only 16 remained. Stealth no longer mattered. The Russians knew the area they were flying through. Zoopark had pointed the way. The Panzer S-1 near the main runway had begun the hunt. The only choice left was speed. Every passing second pushed them another 150 yards closer to Donetsk Airport. Every second survived was 1 step closer to the target. The calculation became cold to the point of cruelty. They no longer needed to disappear. They only needed to arrive before the next air defense layer could lock the sky shut. With about 7 miles remaining, the 16 FP-2S needed less than 5 minutes to reach Donetsk Airport. Warning data was transmitted directly to the defensive command post in the airport area. 16 targets were approaching from the south, below 150 feet, at 120 miles per hour. The commander at Donetsk Airport understood that Russia's previous modern air defense layers had failed. He immediately ordered the closest defensive layer around the airfield to be deployed. Intercept UAVs with UAVs. From field launchers near the hangars and the secondary runway, 1,600 FPV drones were launched. They were not used for reconnaissance. They had been prepared for one mission only: crash straight into the FP-2S. A hit on the wing, fuselage, or engine section would be enough to pull a larger UAV out of the sky. The Russian soldiers reacted very quickly. The first 5 FPVs cut across the Ukrainian formation from the flank as the FP-2S were flying at 150 feet. The first pair slammed into the left wing of one FP-2. The second pair hit the tail section. The fifth struck the lower fuselage, causing the control system to lose stability. In less than 40 seconds, 5 FP-2S were dragged out of formation and crashed into open ground outside the airport. But the Ukrainian control crews did not panic. They had prepared for this kind of interception. The weakness of the Russian FPVs was not speed, but flight time and control range. They could sprint fast for a few minutes, but they could not pursue for long like the FP-2S, which used combustion engines and could hold steady speed over a long distance. So instead of rushing straight into Donetsk Airport, the FP-2S pulled the formation into a wide arc. On Russian screens, it looked like a mistake. But in reality, it was a trap designed to pull the FPV drones away from their favorable defensive position and burn through their flight time. The Russian FPVs accelerated at maximum power. One caught up with the last target in the formation in FP-2, deliberately holding a straight path and moving 1 beat slower than the rest. The collision tore open its right wing and dragged it down. The Russians had just shot down one more drone, but by then, most of the Hunter FPVs had been pulled too far away from the main protected area. Their batteries dropped quickly. Their control signals weakened as they flew over industrial strips, warehouses, and low terrain around Donetsk. One by one, they began losing altitude. One crashed into open ground. Another fell onto a warehouse roof. The rest were forced to abandon the pursuit before they could return to cover the runway. At this point, the Russians had only the final interception layer right along the airport perimeter. Soldiers deployed handheld interceptor UAVs from near the security fence and earth berms around the technical area. The distance was too short to create a wide interception loop, but close enough to launch directly into the FP-2's attack path, interceptor. Thus, others launched almost back-to-back. One struck the belly of the leading FP-2. The other hit the wing of the second target, causing it to roll sideways and crash outside the airport fence. But the price of that success was time. The distance was now only about 1.5 miles. The remaining 9 FP-2S had passed the S-300, survived Krasuka 4, escaped Panzer S-1, crossed the FPV layer, and broken through the final interception line. They were lowering their noses into the final attack angle. At nearly 120 miles per hour, they needed less than 40 seconds to cover the remaining distance. The Russian commander watched the target icons closing in on the perimeter of Donetsk Airport. There was no longer enough time to redeploy. No longer enough distance to build a new defensive layer. All that remained was the roar of combustion engines close to the ground and 9 black shadows diving toward the runway area, storage depots, and Shahed UAV launch platforms that Russia had once believed were still safely behind its defensive line. Finally, the remaining 9 FP-2S saw Donetsk Airport. They no longer needed GPS, they no longer needed radio communication, they no longer needed any signal that could allow the Russians to detect them again. The optical camera in the nose began locking onto the main runway area where Shahed UAV launch platforms, specialized transport vehicles, and Russian crews on combat duty were preparing for a new deployment wave. At an altitude of 150 feet, the UAV formation skimmed close to the ground, crossed the outer fence, the protective earth berms, and the scattered technical structures around the airfield. The final phase had begun. The first drone dived straight into the mobile Shahed launch area. On the ground, Russian vehicles were still positioned around the runway, preparing to activate Geron-2 launch systems. Some soldiers on duty tried to fire upward with infantry weapons, but at such high speed and low altitude, they saw only black shadows flashing past before it was too late. The FP-2 struck the first launcher cluster, creating a powerful explosion, throwing launch equipment into the air and disrupting the entire launch preparation process. The second drone slammed into a group of specialized transport vehicles parked near the technical area. These vehicles were used to carry Shahed UAVs, replacement components, and launch support equipment. The strike set one vehicle on fire, and the flames quickly spread to nearby trucks. Within seconds, the area once used for UAV resupply and deployment turned into a thick cloud of smoke covering part of the runway. The third drone selected an even more dangerous target, the storage area for warheads and additional assembly components. The nose camera recorded rows of containers, low warehouses, and technical vehicles packed tightly inside the logistics zone. When the FP-2 dived down, the first explosion triggered a series of secondary blasts. Bomb storage areas, ammunition, and warhead components were hit, shaking the entire sector. This was no longer a strike on a single vehicle. It was a strike on the very stockpile Russia needed to sustain Shahed launch waves from Donetsk Airport. The fourth drone dived into the fuel station and refueling truck area. Small tanks, technical pipelines, high-pressure refueling points, and fuel trucks were clustered inside the same logistics section. The impact caused the area to erupt violently, cutting off the ability to refuel, repair, and rapidly redeploy Russian units at the airfield. Nearby cranes, specialized maintenance equipment, and support nodes were also destroyed or heavily damaged. The remaining 5 UAVs arrived when the entire airport was already under alarm. Their cameras swept across the runway, where black smoke was rising from launch platforms, transport vehicles, and logistics depots. The onboard processors selected the remaining parts of the Shahed deployment cluster, where launch vehicles were still positioned near the runway edge, and then dived. These final strikes blew apart another group of launch equipment and paralyzed Russia's UAV deployment route at Donetsk Airport. The result was not just a handful of destroyed targets. The mobile launch platforms and specialized transport vehicles used to carry, prepare, and launch Shahed UAVs had been hit. Warhead stockpiles, assembly components, fuel stations, refueling trucks, and technical equipment were seriously damaged. The most important logistics points around the runway were either flattened or forced out of operation. Tactically, the meaning of the strike was even greater. Ukraine did not only attack Donetsk Airport, it struck directly at the operating chain behind Russia's Shahed launch waves. When launch platforms are destroyed, transport vehicles are burned, warhead depots are hit, and the fuel station is no longer functioning, Russia cannot continue deploying UAVs at the same rhythm. Launch missions, test flights, and attack sorties are forced to be delayed or canceled. Strategically, Donetsk Airport could no longer be considered a safe rear base. Russia had used it as a gathering point for vehicles, storage, launch platforms, and support systems for Shahed attacks meant to pressure Ukraine. But with only 9 FP-2s breaking through the final defensive layers, Ukraine managed to paralyze a critical part of the high-value support chain connecting Donetsk Airport to the wider front. The 9 FP-2s did not just strike the runway, they struck Russia's ability to launch UAVs, resupply, repair, and maintain continuous pressure in Donetsk. And that is the real meaning of this attack. There is no need to destroy the entire airport, only to hit the points that force the whole system behind it to stop. If you found this analysis useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. How do you think low-flying UAV tactics will continue to change the battlefield? Goodbye.